over the last 5 or 6 years, I've really been focusing a lot on the potential implications of technologies like robotics and artificial intelligence. And I've really come around to the view that we could well be on the leading edge of a very significant disruption. And I think it's a disruption that could ultimately end up putting a tremendous amount of stress both on the economy and on society. And the central idea here, of course, is that robots, smart algorithms, machines in general are increasingly going to substitute for human workers. They're going to take over more and more of the work that's now being done by people, and I think that that ultimately could lead to a big challenge for us. Now, during the course of my research, I've talked to a lot of people who are really on the leading edge of these technologies, the people driving innovations in artificial intelligence and robotics. And what I've found is, at least among that technical group, there is a kind of an emerging consensus that perhaps we really are headed toward this disruption, or perhaps to a genuinely new era where things are going to operate differently from what we've seen in the past. But on the other hand, there's still a lot of skepticism about that whole idea that this time might be different. And I think it's probably fair to say that economists as a group tend to be quite skeptical of that. And the skepticism is largely based on the historical record. It turns out that this idea that machines might displace workers and perhaps create lots of employment, it goes back at least 200 years to the Luddite revolts in England, and since then it's come up again and again. In my latest book, I talk a bit about the Triple Revolution report, which most people have probably never heard of, but it was a formal report. It was put together by a brilliant group of people, including 2 Nobel laureates. And this report was delivered to the President of the United States, and it argued that the US was on the brink of major economic and social upheaval as industrial automation put millions and millions of people out of work. And the report argued that the administration better take action right away or there was going to be chaos. That report was delivered to President Lyndon Johnson in March of 1964. So that's now over 50 years ago. And obviously, we're still waiting for that big disruption to happen. So it is reasonable to be skeptical about this whole idea. But I think there are good reasons to believe that this time is really different. And given that I'm going to argue that, I think it's really important to articulate what exactly is different about today's technology relative to what we've seen in the past. And I would point to 3 fundamental things. The first thing is, of course, that we have this ongoing process of acceleration. Now, I think everyone by now has heard of Moore's law, or this rule of thumb that says computers have roughly doubled in speed every 2 years or so. But actually, it's much broader than that. It extends, for example, to communications bandwidth, where we see an acceleration. It extends, in many cases, to software, which in many cases has accelerated at a rate that is even in excess of what would be implied by Moore's law. And the other thing that's really critical is that this acceleration has now been going on for a long time. In fact, it's been going on for decades. If you measure from the late 1950s, when the first integrated circuits were fabricated, since that time, we've seen something on the order of perhaps 27 or 30 doublings in computing power, which is just an extraordinary number of times to double something. You can sort of get an idea of what that would mean by imagining that you get in your car and start driving along at about 5 miles per hour, now gradually double your speed to 10, to 20, to 40. If you do that just a handful of times, you'll need a racetrack and a faster car. If you could do that 30 times, you would be something out of science fiction. You'd be a spaceship traveling at millions of miles per hour. You'd be able to get to another planet in just a few minutes. And that's really where we are today, relative to where we began when the first computing circuits were put into place. So the point there is that we're now seeing an extraordinary amount of absolute progress. We're cruising along at really an extraordinary speed. And for that reason, I think that over the next couple of decades, we're going to see things that we're really not prepared for. We're going to see innovations that very likely astonish us. And I think that really portends a time of great change. The second really critical issue is that today's information technology, today's AI is increasingly taking on cognitive capability. It's really not just about muscle power anymore. In a limited sense, the machines are beginning to think. Machines are making decisions. They're solving problems. And most importantly, they're learning. If there's one technology that is probably really central to this and really has become kind of the driving force behind what I'm talking about here. It's machine learning. It's this idea that we now have smart algorithms that can churn through massive amounts of data, and based on that, they can make predictions. They can figure things out. They can learn. And that's becoming just an extraordinary, broad-based, powerful technology, especially in the area of deep learning. And it's something that will have applications really across the board, across the job market, across industries, and so forth. One way to really kind of get a handle on just how broad-based that ultimately can be is to kind of imagine some random job out there in the economy and ask yourself, for this typical worker, would it be possible for another smart person, if they studied a very detailed historical record of everything this worker has done in the past, could another person, by studying that record, figure out how to do that job? Or perhaps could another person watch this person working and figure out how to do that job? And if the answer is yes, then it's probably a reasonable bet that eventually there's going to be a smart algorithm or a robot that will take fundamentally that same approach and will learn how to do that type of work. So when you think in that sense, I mean, I think it becomes obvious that there are a lot of jobs out there that another person could in fact learn to do by studying that kind of a detailed record. So that's the reason that this is likely, I think, to be quite disruptive. There is an enormous percentage of jobs, maybe something on the order of half of the jobs or even more, that are going to be susceptible to machine learning. The third thing that I think is really critical is that information technology and increasingly artificial intelligence is becoming a true general purpose technology. It's something that's going to be everywhere. It's going to invade every sector of the economy. It's not going to be limited to any one particular industry or employment sector. Many people have compared it to electricity. And you wouldn't ask what industry is going to be most transformed by electricity. That's kind of a dumb question. We know the answer is every industry. And the same is going to be true of artificial intelligence and robotics. So the point here is it's going to be extraordinarily broad-based. There aren't going to be any particular safe havens that aren't impacted or will be relatively safe for workers. It's going to come for everything. And that's quite different from what we've seen historically. You can think, for example, of the mechanization of agriculture, which was really one very dramatic example of technological disruption. Millions of people lost their jobs on farms, and eventually, of course, they moved on to factories, and then later on, they moved to the service sector. But agricultural technology was specific and mechanical. It was tractors and combines and so forth, and it impacted one sector of the economy. What we have today in information technology and AI is something that will scale across everything more or less simultaneously, and I think that that's a big part of the reason that this time could quite well be different. One thing that people will say, almost to the point that it becomes a cliche, people who are a bit skeptical of this, is that it is true, of course, that many jobs that exist today are going to be disrupted, but we will also create new jobs, things that maybe we can't imagine. And that's certainly true. You can already think of some jobs that exist today that just a short while ago you wouldn't have been able to anticipate, things like website designers, social media marketers, and so forth. But it turns out that while these new jobs exist, they really aren't a large fraction of employment. What I'm showing on the bar chart on the right here is that about 90% of the workers in the United States are now engaged in occupations that existed 100 years ago. So it's things like driving vehicles and preparing and serving food and working in offices. These are all jobs that someone in the year 1915 would have been quite familiar with, and that's where nearly everyone still works. So as we look forward, we can anticipate that certainly new areas of work will be created, but we also know that these traditional areas are likely to be disrupted, and that's going to be an enormous number of jobs. Just think, for example, of the impact of self-driving vehicles. That's millions and millions of jobs. And certainly new things will be created, but will there be enough of those jobs? And secondly, will they be accessible to the person that might be driving a taxi today? Perhaps these new jobs are going to require very high levels of education and training and capability. So there may be both an absolute shortfall of jobs and a skill mismatch issue where the jobs that are created really are not a good match for a lot of the average people that need jobs. So again, I think that portends a challenge. So let me just show you a couple of graphs taken from the United States primarily, what I think demonstrate that technology is already having an impact. What you see here is a comparison of productivity and compensation. Now, productivity is basically the value of what we produce divided by the number of hours that it takes to produce it. And if you look at this graph, you'll notice that up until the mid-1970s, these two lines move in perfect lockstep. And if you pick up any economics textbook, it will tell you that this is the way things should really work. The idea is that innovation drives productivity increases. The machines, the tools that workers are using get better. Those workers then can produce more, and they should become more valuable. They should get higher wages, and prosperity then kind of scales across the entire population. That's just what happened right up until 1973 or so. But then you see these two lines decouple, and this big wedge is opening up. Productivity has continued to climb, but compensation has stagnated for a great many workers in the United States. So what's causing this? I think one of the big things that's driving this is that the nature of our technology is in fact changing. And where once machines were clearly tools that made workers more valuable, in many cases, machines and technology are transitioning to become substitutes rather than complements for workers. In other words, rather than making workers less or more valuable, they're actually substituting for workers or de-skilling jobs and therefore making workers in some cases less valuable. And I think that that is one of the important things that's really driving this gap that we see opening up here. And this is a phenomenon that I think is causing a lot of anger and frustration. I think that if you want to understand why Donald Trump became so popular, this graph in part explains that, the fact that people are being left behind. All the fruits of innovation are now going to the people at the top, to business owners, investors, executives, and average people are getting very, very little of that. And I think that that's likely to accelerate in the future and could drive even more anger. Here's a graph showing what job creation has looked like in the United States over the last half century or so. And you can see it looks almost like a declining staircase. Every decade just about has produced fewer new jobs in percentage terms than the preceding decade. So it's almost as though there's some kind of structural shift happening, which is causing the economy to get less and less effective at creating new jobs. And I believe that technology is certainly one of the most important explanations for that. So there is good evidence to suggest that technology is already having an impact, and I think we can absolutely expect that to become much more dramatic in the coming decades. So let me talk a bit about some of the actual innovations driving this. Robots, of course, have been around for a long time. If you had gone into an automotive factory back in the 1980s, you would have already seen big robots. But what that has meant is that in advanced countries, all of the really rote, repetitive assembly line jobs have already disappeared, and the jobs that have been left for people have been those that are to some extent unpredictable. They might be things like unloading and loading boxes, or doing things as part of the process that rely on visual perception and dexterity. Those are the jobs that so far have been safe for people. But this is an illustration of a company in Silicon Valley that has built a robot that is specifically geared toward moving boxes. And it's, you can see that it looks kind of like a machine or a robotic arm. And on the end of that is a machine vision camera. And you'll notice in this illustration that the boxes are not stacked precisely. There are gaps, there are different shapes and sizes and so forth. Up until very recently, figuring out how to move these boxes would have been a visual perception and dexterity problem that only a person would have been able to solve. But this company has built a machine to do it. They expect that eventually it will be able to move about one box every second, and that compares with about one box every 6 seconds for a person. This machine is going to work continuously, never going to injure itself, never going to file a workers' compensation claim. So you can see how as this technology gets more affordable and reliable, it's going to become disruptive. More and more businesses are going to rely on this, and that's going to mean the loss of a lot of jobs. Now, there's a conventional way of thinking about this kind of work. If you've got a job lifting heavy boxes all day, that's probably not a great job. You're likely to injure yourself, maybe even become disabled. So in a sense, it's true to say if that job is eliminated by a machine, that's not something we should be upset about. That's a great thing. And there's, of course, a solution to that. And the solution historically has always been take that worker that loses that job, send that person back to school, give them some more training, let them move up the skills ladder. Maybe they end up working in an office in a safer environment. And here's a graph that I think illustrates why that particular approach may not be viable indefinitely. This is focused on white-collar automation, and it's looking at the headcount in the corporate finance department of the largest US corporations. If you look at that bar chart on the right, it shows that the headcount in that department, and this would be accountants, financial planners, accounts payable and receivable people, the number of people in that department relative to the revenue of the corporation has collapsed by about 40% in the last decade. And it's happened largely because of smart software, which is taking on more and more of this work. So clearly technology, AI, machine learning is beginning to climb that skills ladder. It's not just about blue collar work anymore. It's increasingly about white collar work. And in many cases, it's work that's being done by university graduates. And there are many examples that you can give. In the field of journalism, for example, there are smart systems that can tap into a stream of data. And based on that, they can analyze that data, figure out what's interesting about it, and then they can weave together a very compelling news story. And by one account, every 30 seconds or so, there's a story published on the internet or maybe in a newspaper that's generated by a machine. And you can read one of those articles, and it won't be obvious to you at all that it was written, by an algorithm and not by a person. And we see similar advances in the field of law, where algorithms are being used to use document review in some areas of medicine and so forth. So very clearly, technology is getting more capable. It's climbing that skills ladder. So that, to me, that implies that this historical approach that we've always had to give people more education, more training, may not be sustainable indefinitely. We may need to think outside the box in terms of coming up with a solution to this. Now, here's a graph that shows that in the United States, over the last decade or so, earnings for university graduates have actually gone into decline. So it may well be that this is already having an impact on more skilled jobs, on the types of jobs that are done by university graduates. So again, I think it's something that is potentially a very important and very, very disruptive trend. Now, one of the other things that I think is very important is that all of this, of course, has a social impact if people end up with low jobs or with jobs that are de-skilled and low wages, but there's also a very important economic impact. The economy has to have consumers. You've got to have people out there that are capable of buying the products and services being produced. If you don't have that, that's ultimately a threat to the market economy, to capitalism itself. If you don't have enough demand out there, enough people who can buy what's being produced, you run the risk of getting into kind of a downward deflationary spiral. You can think of that in terms of a very rich person like Bill Gates. Now, Bill Gates, in theory, has got an infinite amount of purchasing power, but he's not going to just go out and buy and buy and buy. For example, he's not going to buy 1,000 cars. He's not going to buy 1,000 smartphones. He's definitely not going to go to 1,000 restaurants in one night and sit down and have dinner. So when you take purchasing power, income from 1,000 average people and instead concentrate that into the hands of one very wealthy person, you take something out of the economy. You take away from unit demand. You remove customers that businesses rely on. And I think that that's a trend that's going to be increasingly important, especially as you look around the world today. You see that many advanced economies are kind of trapped in very low growth scenarios. We've got interest rates at zero. Central banks seem to be unable to raise the interest rate. So there's some evidence to suggest, I think, that all of this is already playing a role. And this is a graph that I think also illustrates this. And this shows just since the end of the Great Recession in the United States, a comparison of corporate profits and retail sales. And you can see this gap opening up. You may recall that during recovery from the recession, corporations had historic levels of profitability. But what we're seeing here is that they were profitable, but mostly that was because they cut costs. In many cases, they cut workers. They became more efficient. For the most part, it was not because they were selling more. And clearly, that's not sustainable. You can't have ever-increasing corporate profits or a thriving general economy without actually being able to sell more. And in order to sell more products and services, you, of course, have got to have workers out there that are capable of buying what you're selling. So finally, what it really comes down to then is a question: what do we do about all of this if this really develops into a disruptive trend over the next couple of decades? And I think ultimately it comes down to a choice. It's easy to imagine a very utopian outcome to all of this, and certainly in Silicon Valley, there are plenty of people who have that assumption. You can imagine a future where people have to work less. We have more time for leisure. No one has to do a dangerous job. No one has to do a job that is boring or that they really hate. People have more choices, more opportunities to do things that lead to genuine happiness and growth and to spend time with their families and so forth. And that's all great. And I think that that's a vision that we should embrace. And I hope that we can move in that direction. But what I believe is that that's not going to come about automatically. I think we're actually going to have to take action. We're going to have to put policies in place to make that happen. And I think ultimately what it may come down to is finding a way to decouple incomes from traditional jobs. And that would point to something like a guaranteed income, a universal basic income, which right now remains a very radical idea, but it is an idea that's getting more traction. In Silicon Valley, people are talking about it. There are a couple of countries out there that are going to begin pilot projects, for example, in the Netherlands and in Finland. And it's an idea that I think eventually may become inevitable. It may be sort of the direction that we have to move as these trends develop if we want to have a thriving society and a thriving economy. So my purpose in talking about this is to get you all thinking about it and debating it and discussing it. And my hope is that as we have that discussion more generally, some real solutions are going to emerge so that we can figure out a way to make sure that the incredible innovations that I'm sure we're going to see over the next couple of decades can be leveraged on behalf of everyone in our society, rather than seeing the benefits accrue only to the people at the very top. So thank you very much.